buenas tardes, good evening. Welcome to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. I am Pedro Eusebio, the director of those Spanish cultural institutes in Northern England. It's for us a great pleasure to have you again in this series of lectures about bilingualism. And today we will have the honor to hear Professor Dr. Cristina María Moreira Flores, who will speak about how stable are early acquired languages in context of migration. It is a question, and she will explain later on her point of view on the research she has been doing about it. Thank you very much, Cristina, for accepting our invitation. Thank you again to Julio Villagarcía, who has been coordinating this series. Now we are already on the third year, and we are very pleased because it has been a great success. Cristina María Morales Flores is Associate Professor in German Linguistics at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Minho in Portugal, but she will be presented by Dr. Julio Villagarcía. This series, some of you already know, the public who is following the series, is about bilingualism, how important is for all of us to speak different languages. And in this importance, there are also so many questions that we try to answer, or to give some information or some answers about the advantages, but also the challenges of bilingualism, especially for children. There are many received ideas about that bilingualism can make the children confused, and the development of the 2 or 3 languages might be slower as when they are monolingual. Some of the topics have been analyzed in this series, proving with scientific data that is very far from that. Bilingualism is always an advantage, a great advantage in education for children. They are more creative, they are more open to new cultures, to new experience. And when we refer about adults, what we can say is already been proved that for people who are in a certain age, when you learn or you are able to speak different languages, it makes your brain more effective, and in that sense, it prolongs your ability to have your health brain and to have better memory and many other advantages. But anyway, before I pass the floor to Julio Villagarcía, I will introduce him, and also as something new tonight, those of you who would like to follow the debate, the lecture by Cristina Flores, you can follow that in Spanish. We have the support of José Blázquez, who is the translator and interpreter. You just only have to press CC and choose the language on which you want to follow the discussion tonight, in English as now, or in Spanish with the help with José. So Dr. Villagarcía is sorry, the papers are mixed up, and now I had to. Yes, Dr. Villagarcía is a senior lecturer in Spanish Linguistics and Syntax in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at the University of Manchester, and at the moment he is currently a Maria Zambrano Senior Researcher at his alma mater, University of Oviedo in Asturias in northern Spain. In the course of his PhD at the University of Connecticut, Julio was trained as a theoretical statistician and as a language acquisitionist, working within the framework of minimalism. His current interests lie in the areas of Spanish Romance and English linguistics, and other fields of research and also interests, of course, include the child language acquisition, bilingualism, and also the application of theoretical linguistic research to foreign second language pedagogy, which is one of the aims of this series. So thank you, Julio, for your great support for what has been achieved in this series throughout these 3 years. And without further ado, I give you the floor. Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos y espero que disfruten de la conferencia. And also, let me say you that at the end, of course, we will have some time for question and answer in our chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Pedro. This time, actually, I am at my doctoral alma mater in Connecticut, the United States. And well, as Pedro said, I'm Julio from the Lingual Research Group at the University of Oviedo and also from the University of Manchester. Today, it's a real honor to introduce Dr. Cristina Flores. She will be delivering today's talk as part of the 2023 Bilingualism series of the Instituto, which, as the director mentioned a minute ago, is now in its 3rd edition, something we really take pride in. Cristina María Moreira Flores is currently Associate Professor with Habilitation for German Linguistics at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Minho in Braga, in Portugal. In 2008, she received her PhD in German linguistics from Minho plus Hamburg. And the title of her dissertation was, or is, The Syntactic Competence of Portuguese-German Returnees, a Study on Language Attrition. So as you can imagine, this is a topic we will hear much more about tonight. Cristina's research focuses on bilingual language development with particular attention to heritage language acquisition, as well as language attrition, also known as language loss. She has coordinated several projects on bilingualism, especially taking into account Portuguese and German, as well alongside L2 acquisition. Cristina, as you can imagine, has an unbroken record of publication, is an often cited scholar, which basically makes her a very, very important or outstanding figure in the realm of heritage acquisition. Cristina was director of the Research Center on Humanities in the period 2019-2022. At present, she directs the double degree Master on Portuguese-German Studies. She's a board member of the PhD program on Language Science, as well as president of the Portuguese Linguistics Association. She has been associate editor of Linguistic Approaches to Bilingualism, which is housed in John Benjamin's, very prominent publishing company in the field, Heritage Language Journal. She's been co-editor of the series Language Development. Well, as you know, all of these are premier outlets in the field, okay? She was also co-editor of the journal Real, Revista de Estudios Germanísticos, and the journal Diacrítica. She was actually a member of the Ethic Committee for Research on Social Science and Humanities at the University of Minho, also in the period 2019-2022. And well, we are here to listen to Cristina, and today's title is How Stable Are Early Acquired Languages in Contexts of Migration and Remigration. Okay, this will be a key concept today. So I don't think we can wait more to listen to Cristina. Please join me in welcoming her without further ado. Obrigado, Cristina. Many thanks.
So, gracias. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this very nice introduction. I'm very honored to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about my research. And I will start with sharing. Yeah, so I will talk about the studies, the research I'm doing since my PhD on Portuguese-German bilingualism, as Julio said, and very briefly, so the aims of this talk are to discuss a special case, special situation. It's the effects of loss of contact with the language. So what happens if a bilingual speaker loses contact with one of the native languages acquired in childhood? And then to come up with a definition of what is language attrition in this situation. And I argue that language acquisition is acquiring and then stabilizing knowledge, and attrition is somehow destabilization of linguistic knowledge. And I will show this on the basis of some research I did on Portuguese, German bilingual speakers. And also to show that heritage, is it working? Okay, yeah. That heritage language development is not the same as language attrition, so that we have to distinguish these concepts, these realities. First, I'm working on Portuguese-German bilingualism, and so on bilingualism involving Portuguese. This is an invitation by the Cervantes. So on Spanish, I think you know less about Portuguese in contact with other language, and this is very brief introduction to the situations where Portuguese is in contact, in a bilingualism context. So we have, of course, Portuguese as official language in the so-called former colonies, mainly in Africa, and here we have different degrees of bilingualism. We have, for example, Angola with high degree of bilingualism with Portuguese and the native languages, and other countries like Timor, where Portuguese is still a second language and low degree of bilingualism. Migration to Portugal, we have around 5% of immigrant population in Portugal. Most of them are actually Portuguese speaking, because most of them are from Brazil, or half of them are from Brazil. And so here we can't talk about bilingualism, but more about bidialectalism. So we have two variations. And then we have Portuguese migration, and this is a population that I studied. And you maybe don't know, but in the EU, Portugal, after Malta, is the country with the highest rate of emigrated population. So 22% of Portuguese people born in Portugal do not live in Portugal, so they live abroad. And so this is a very high rate for Portugal. And then we have also different waves of migration and remigration. And this is also very important for my research, the waves of remigration. So people who migrated, and then at some point of their life, they came back to Portugal with their families. And so this is also so some remarks on Portuguese migration. So we see the waves of people who leave Portugal, and we see this point where the crisis was, the Troika, where we had very high immigration, and this famous sentence by our former prime minister when the crisis, the Troika, was in Portugal, that the solution would be to migrate. So that's what he told the young people. Of course, we know migration changed over the years, but what is here also to highlight is that we have Portuguese communities in many different countries and continents. I focused my research on the German-speaking population in Germany and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland. There is a program, a more recent program called Programa Regressar. So there are some efforts to promote remigration so that people come back with some decisions. Of course, it is not clear if there's any success in this, but there is this promotion of this program, Regressar, a hora de voltar a casa. So it's time to come home, to Portuguese immigrants come back to Portugal. And so I highlight this because this is the population that I will focus on in this talk. So we have different types of migrated families, so very recently migrated families, and then, for example, already third generation migrants whose grandparents migrated in the 60s, for example, to Germany. some remarks on this population. What my own work showed was that there's a continuous presence of Portuguese as home language, even in the second generation. There's a strong tie to Portugal, holidays spent in Portugal, for example, frequent marriages to partners in Portugal. And then there is this strong, and I can say that well-organized network of heritage language courses that are organized by the Camões Institute, so the Portuguese institution that is similar to Cervantes. And so the Camões Institute pays teachers in every country where there is a big community of Portuguese migrants. And for example, in Germany and in Switzerland, we had in Germany about 100 schools who offer these extracurricular courses of Portuguese as heritage language in the afternoon. And for example, in Switzerland, it's around 79, I think now it's a bit less, but 75, 76 teachers of Portuguese working as heritage language teachers. Portuguese heritage speakers, we can say they grow up with exposure to Portuguese as home language, so as heritage language. That's when we use the concept of heritage language. But it's mainly contact with colloquial Portuguese, it's oral input. There are some contact, as I said, through these heritage language courses with more formal registers, some literacy skills. But what is normal is that German becomes the preferred language, becomes the dominant language, and because it's the language of schooling, of friends, siblings, and so on. What does this mean, this situation? And this is typical, yeah, it's nothing new. It's for Portuguese, for Spanish, for most heritage speaker communities, is that there is variability of bilingual competence. So what Ortega called gradient bilingualism. So there's variation because, of course, there's variation in the input at home, in the degree of literacy skills. So children who do not attend these courses, children who attend these courses all their childhood, and so on. Attitudes are different, so there's variation, but still we can talk about very stable bilingualism. And what does this mean? That these heritage speakers, so the second generation, even some third generation children, they are found to be very proficient. So what does this mean? They can have conversations, they understand Portuguese. So Portuguese is a language of communication in their daily life. Of course, this doesn't mean that it's exactly the same language as it is spoken in Portugal and as it is spoken by monolingual speakers. And we know heritage languages, they show some particularities. So they are not they are not the same as the language spoken by monolingual speakers, but we have to distinguish, and that's important, between heritage language development and attrition. Attrition is a loss of language skills. So, and I will come back to this. Just a summary, because this is not the main focus of my talk. What does it mean? Particularities. When is a heritage language somehow different? So I did several studies on this with colleagues, and we have shown that, for example, heritage languages, they may promote processes of language change. There's this proposal that we made that, for example, heritage speakers, that they may produce more null objects, and so we somehow promote something that is already going on in Portuguese. There are properties that show delay in the acquisition of Portuguese as heritage language. So properties that are very hard to acquire, for example, the subjunctive or clitic pronouns. There's much more variation when we hear a heritage speaker speaking. There are more marks of colloquial register, of course. So these are, and there are structures that we only see in written Portuguese. And of course, if a speaker does not have contact with written Portuguese, he will or she will not acquire these structures. So these are some particularities of Portuguese as heritage language, or Portuguese or any other heritage language. But what we can say, and this is what I want to highlight, is that under normal input conditions, this means with exposure, regular exposure, at home or with parents, so in daily life, even under unbalanced input conditions, even if it's less than the other language, but if there is regular contact, what research has shown is that there is a steady growing of the language, of the grammatical systems. So of course, it's not exactly the same as the grammar as monolingual speakers, as I said, and we know now it doesn't make sense to compare them directly, but if there's contact, there's development, and there's a growing of what we call mental grammatical systems. But, and this is the focus of my talk, what happens if input conditions change? So if there is no longer exposure to one of the native languages. And when can this happen, that the input conditions change? So this can happen even without a change of the environment. So this can happen, for example, if the language habits within the family change. And we know that there are families that stop using the heritage language when children go to school, for example, because parents think it's better to speak only the language of school. We know it's not, this is a myth, but this happens often. It may also change because the family constellation changes due to divorce or death of a family member or so on. But then there's the other case is input conditions change because there's a change of environment. And this happens due to immigration, refugees. And then the case that will interest us today is remigration. So when the children or teenagers go back to the country of origin of their parents, so the so-called returnees. Other situations are adoption, for example, also documented cases of international adoption, and there is loss of contact with the native language due to environment change. So we will focus on returnees, and there is not, so there are not many people working on returnees. So this is a small field. What are returnees? As I said, returnees are people who live in the context of migration. Often they were born in this country, but then the family decide to go back to the country of origin. And this may happen when the children are still young children or teenagers, or even as adults, that they can decide to go back. And so this, we talk about returnees, but often it's not a real return, because often the children were born in the host country, but it's a return to the country of their parents. So that's, we still say it's return because it's the return of the family. Why is this interesting, the returnees? So we have, before the moment of return, the cases I talked at the beginning of my talk. We have the heritage language, that is the language of the family, but it's usually not the preferred language and not the dominant language of the children. So the dominant language and the language the children prefer is the language of the society where they live, the so-called host country, the dominant language. But children, they grow up with what we can say 2 native languages, even though they prefer or are more dominant in one of them. But then they return to the country of their heritage language. And this means generally a significant change in the dominant environment, because one of the languages is now absent from the daily life. And of course, it depends from the country where the children move away. So if it's from the US, for example, and they go back to Portugal, then English is still very present. If they move back from Germany, and that these are the cases I analyzed, then German is no longer present in their daily lives, if it's not a family language. And that's normally the case, that German is not the family language, but Portuguese is the family language. So this is the situation. And I have here an example of a returnee, and this one, that's me, because I grew up in Germany, and I came to Portugal, to the country of my parents, and so I'm a returnee. And in my class there, well, this was my best friend who returned to Croatia, and this is another friend who returned to Turkey. So in this group, we had 3 returnees, and thanks to Facebook, we are still in contact after these years. So if we study this population, there are 2 interesting dimensions, and both are very interesting. First off, one is to look at what happens to the language that is no longer present in the daily life of the children or even the teenagers. So this is the research on language attrition. What happens if there's loss of exposure? Of course, the other dimension that is also very interesting is the dimension on re-exposure. So what happens to their Portuguese if it showed some differences while they were living in Germany? If they go back, what happens to their Portuguese? I will focus on this, what happens to their German. That, as I recall, was the dominant language of the children. Some questions, I don't think that I will answer all of them, but so the questions are, how does the return and the loss of continued exposure to the once dominant language affect the returnees' bilingual competence? And is it loss of knowledge? Do we have restructuring of grammar? When do attrition effects appear? If they appear, when do they appear? And what influences these attrition effects? So the question is, how stable, and that's the title of my talk, how stable are acquired languages? So if the child is fully bilingual and then leaves the country and goes to another country where one language is no longer present, how stable is this language that was the dominant language? And here I go back to this data that Julio mentioned, that I collected during my PhD, that was that I did in Braga and in Hamburg. So I interviewed heritage speakers or bilingual speakers who grew up in Germany and also in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and then they moved to Portugal and were living in Portugal when I contacted them. And all these cases are typical cases of stable bilingualism while they lived in Germany or in Switzerland. And these are the groups that I contacted, that I interviewed. So people who moved to Portugal at a very young age, so before they went to school in Germany, then people who went to Portugal during primary school, then as teenagers, and some as young adults. So when they entered the university. And so there are different groups, and this is interesting because they allow us answer different questions. So, and I will start with this. So these are the groups. Some returned very early and still during childhood, and they had no contact with German after going back. So it was not a family language. It was not a language. It was not a school language in Portugal. And so there was almost no contact. And some came after age 12, but also with very reduced contact. And then I had the group who had more contact with German even after going back. But this first group, these were people, I contacted them, they were adults. And they were born in Germany and went to Portugal before they, or in the first year or before they went to school in Germany. And they had no contact with German. And in this case, what happened was that I couldn't, of course, interview them because they did not understand German. So they told me they could not understand me. They could not maintain a conversation, but even they were not able to understand my question. So I could not test these ones, and they were not included in my database for my dissertation. But sorry, did the sharing stop? Can you see the sharing? I stopped seeing it.
We see it twice. Oh, now.
No, okay. Okay, thank you. Good. So what I did with a colleague, with Andrea Raube, was to test if these individuals, if they retained some competence in German, knowing that they did not even understand very basic questions like how old are you, wie alt bist du? So no productive, no receptive competence. So we did a perception test. We tested them with a perception task where they had to discriminate the sounds. So and we focused on vowels because the German vowel system is very different from the Portuguese vowel system. It has the particularity of having what we say long and short vowels. An example are these two R's, Stadt and Staat, so R and R, that are different in German, but for a Portuguese speaker, it's the same, it's R. So the question was, do they retain some phonological remnants? And we did this task and gave this task to these speakers and to native speakers of Portuguese who never learned German, who had no contact with German. And what we could see, this was very interesting, is that there were indeed remnants of phonetic knowledge. So these speakers, they were very good in discriminating the German vowels, better than, much better than the Portuguese speakers who did not have any contact with German. And so this is similar to results from, for example, this Hilton-Stem study, who did the same with adoptees. And this shows that even though they lost all their receptive competence, some phonological remnants were still there. So this was an extra study only on this population. What I studied then were these speakers who went to Portugal when they were between 7 and 12, and all of them told me that they were dominant in German and they preferred German when they went back to Portugal. Most of them didn't want to go back. They were children. and they missed Germany, and yeah, but then they came with their families, most of them, to a Portuguese school and had no opportunities to speak German. So some had siblings, and some months after going back to Portugal, they still continued to speak to their siblings, but then also this changed. And so I collected some data through interviews and storytelling, and I won't bother you with this, but I focused my analysis on word orders, on verb placement in German, and I won't go into details into German syntax. What is interesting is that German syntax is very different from Portuguese syntax, mainly regarding verb placement. That is very different. It's acquired very early in German, but it's different from Portuguese. So saying this very generally. What I could see was that the bilingual speakers who went to Portugal before the age of 11, and they could maintain a conversation with me, but their syntax was so full of deviations, so of what we say V3 instances when they should produce V2. So when the verb should be in the second position, they put it in the third position. That's what happens in Portuguese. This is the percentage of deviation, so not correct sentences. And so this group 1 is the group that returned before the age of 11. The group 2 are people who were, for example, 35, 40 years old. They came to Portugal at the age of 13, 14. They had no contact with German. They, at the beginning, they refused to talk in German. They tried to do the interviews in Portuguese, but then we could do it in German. And when they did it in German, there were no problems with V2. So what does it show? That there was instability with regard to the verb position in the speakers who returned to Portugal in early childhood. They had problems with verb position, but it was not fully erased. So they also did construct correct sentences. So it was somehow unstable. Yeah, so 50% of the sentences had some syntactic error, but they also were able to, so they had the rule, sometimes they applied it, sometimes they did not. This was very different from the speakers who came as teenagers, so after age 11. They actually showed very stable knowledge. And then I had also some control children who lived in Germany, and they showed that verb position is not problematic for bilingual children. So if they live in Germany and German is the dominant language, then they don't have problems with this. So this leads to the conclusion that verb placement is acquired. It's acquired early. We know this from other studies, but it seems that this knowledge needs to be stabilized. So when the bilingual children at the age 8, when they produce perfect syntax in German, it seems that this is acquired. Yeah, but what these data show, it's after acquiring or when acquiring this knowledge needs further contact in order to become fixed, yeah, stabilized in the mind. And it seems that this contact is needed until the age of 10, 11, if the speaker loses contact with the language and loses really contact, so it's no longer present in their life, then it seems that this knowledge becomes destabilized, so it's no longer stable. After this period, so if this knowledge is stabilized, then it seems to be no longer vulnerable to real attrition effects, so that and this is also shown by the studies, for example, from Monika Schmidt on the Holocaust refugees who had very stable knowledge of German even 60 years after going to the US. So it seems that age is relevant and for stabilizing knowledge. And there are also evidence from other studies who show this. It depends also on the language, as I said. So with English, written from England, from the UK, or from the US, the results are not so clear because English is it's present, so it's not a strict loss, a drastic loss of contact. So this what we know, what, for example, Köpke and Schmidt said, that the younger the children, the easier it seems to acquire a language. This shows that the easier they also seem to lose the language if it's not completely established or stabilized in their mind. So there are other questions that arise. Is when do these effects arise? So when does it happen that the child loses contact and then starts to show unstable knowledge? And we have some evidence, mainly from case studies of 1 or 2 children who were recorded several times after losing contact. And this is exactly what I did in another study with a girl, Portuguese-German bilingual girl, who was 9 years old when she moved from Hamburg to Portugal. And I recorded her in 4 sessions during 18 months. So the first session was 3 weeks after going back to Portugal, and then 18 months later. And I looked again at word order, at morphology, at object and subject realization, so at several linguistic domains. And so this question was, when does it happen that the first effects appear, and what is affected first, which domain, so which properties? And what I could see, this is an example, and even if you don't understand German, you can see that. So she had to describe this picture, and this is the second session. It was 5 months after going back to Portugal, and we can see she has no problems in describing this in German, and she even produces relative clauses and V2 and verb and all the case is correct. So syntax is fine. And then we have exactly the same picture 8 months later. And what you can see is that she is no longer able to produce complete sentences. So we have the code switching, or she doesn't know the words, or she no longer produces verb second, or okay. So, and this is the rate of errors during this period of observation. So this 18 months later was a control task, because it was no longer able, I was no longer able to have a normal conversation. So I had the task where she had only to construct sentences. So what this shows is that this decline is really fast. So after 5 months later, she started to have problems with case and of course vocabulary, some subject omissions and things that are not possible in German. And 13 months later, we could see problems in all domains, and especially with case and verb placement and so on. And 18 months later, it was very difficult to collect data. So I could observe really loss of productive skills. And so what this shows is that this happens within 1 year. And what the other data show is that if the speaker then continues to not have contact with this language, it remains unstable. So it may continue this way over the lifetime, That's what the adult speakers showed that I interviewed. So what happens, and that's what I claim, is that when the loss of contact happens in childhood, it happens in the first years after return, yeah, and then it remains this way, this unstable knowledge. I don't know the time. You told me 15 minutes, so until 7? Could you confirm how much time I have? I have several studies. I can stop.
I think you are okay
anytime.
if it takes 50 minutes, Cristina. Go ahead.
Okay, good. So the question then that arises is what happens in case of re-immersion. So I have this child, she's living in Portugal now, she has no contact with German, only with me. I was the person who spoke German to her. 18 months later, she didn't want to have a conversation in German. She was in a Portuguese school. So a question is, what happens if she goes back to Germany? Is the knowledge somehow, this unstable knowledge, does it come back, or is it necessary to learn the language again, V2 and case and so on, or does it come back immediately? And this is exactly what happened. So after 4 years after living in Portugal, the family decided to go back to Germany. And I was happy to collect data again when she was living 11 months back in Germany. And it was exactly with the same pictures and the same questions and so on. And so the question was, how is the competence now? So 11 months after living back in Germany. So it was not at the beginning, but that's what we could do. And this is the rate of deviations of incorrect sentences. And what we can see is that from these high degrees of unstable grammar, the deviations decrease, and it's almost close to 0 in almost all domains, except this domain of subject omissions. I won't go into details, you can ask me then, but it comes back. And she told me that in the first month, she did not understand the neighbors, and she went to school and it was very difficult. And it was as if she woke up one day and it was there. So it seems that it comes back. It comes back, and it's not immediately, but it's fast. She was 13 when she went back then to Germany. So what this shows is that linguistic knowledge acquired in childhood, it is not completely erased if a speaker loses contact. It's not completely erased if the loss of contact is not too early. So if it's earlier than age 6, yeah, then it really may disappear. But it's, yeah, before the age of 11, 12, it leads to this unstable knowledge. At least this domain that I analyzed in German, I could see this in morphology and syntax. If it's after age 12, it's this is, sorry, to sum up these case studies, it seems to restabilize in case of re-immersion. Sorry, I wanted to skip this. Okay, so the proposal is that yeah, what we know from neuroscience, that even from what we know about learning is that information is consolidated in different layers of memory through neural connections, and there's a process of memory consolidation. And it seems that this happens also with language. So if in case of loss of input, these connections seem to be weakened, and if it's in early age and it was not sufficiently stabilized, it appears to become unstable. In more recent studies, and I will summarize these studies in 10 minutes, we had the same questions, but with more controlled tasks. So in this study with Joana Matos, we asked exactly the same. How is it? Can we see this age effect even in other domains and with more controlled tasks, with more speakers, and with controlling, for example, with the background questionnaire? Are there these same effects? And so we developed, or Joana developed, 3 tasks, and had also a group of German speakers and a questionnaire controlling for extra linguistic variables. And the question were these: so can we confirm that there are these effects of age in Portuguese returnees? How about variables related with amount of language use, length of incubation? Incubation is how long are they back in Portugal? And also attitudes, because the question is the BLP, and there are also questions on attitudes, and if the attitudes also have an effect. And so these are the tasks. There was a task on vocabulary, a lexical decision task, and then a case marking task. So case, that you may know, is very complex in German. And so it's a good candidate to study language competence. And then a plural production task, because plural in German, there are also 10 different ways of marking the plural. And so these are these are the tasks. And so the group, we had 20 Portuguese German bilingual adults, and all of them were born or grew up in Germany, or in the German part of Switzerland, and then at some time they moved to Portugal as children or as teenagers, or when they entered the university. And so here are some, and very briefly, what we could see was that for lexicon, so the lexical decision task, the amount of contact with German in Portugal was very important, so had an effect. How much German they spoke back in Portugal, the attitude somehow, of course, this is related with the amount of contact. There was no effect of the age when they went back to Portugal. Yeah, this is vocabulary, this is lexicon. But now let's look at grammar. Grammar was studied through this case marking task. So they had to produce sentences and use different cases. So accusative, nominative, dative case, and genitive case. What we could see was that it mattered if they spoke German or not back in Portugal, and also when they went back to Portugal. So the age of return was a relevant factor, and for how long they lived in Germany. So how long, it's the same. It's almost correlated, of course, with the age of return. And also the attitudes towards German. If they wanted if they were identified themselves with German, and if they felt, if they wanted to maintain the German, and so on. There were some questions on German. No effect of age of onset of acquisition. So it didn't matter when they started to learn German, because some started at since birth, or at age 3, age 4, age 5. What matters is how long they lived in Germany. So in order to be able to stabilize the knowledge, and how old they were when they came back. So the plural production task is not so interesting, just that There was no overuse of S. That's the morpheme that also exists in Portuguese and could transfer, but there were no cross-linguistic influence. So what does this mean? That again, the younger the speakers were when they moved back to Portugal, and the less time they lived in Germany, so the less time they had to stabilize this knowledge, the more problems they showed with case. And again, so we argue they need enough time to stabilize. The speakers who went to Portugal at age 13, 14, they almost had no problems with the German grammar. Of course, here it was also relevant if they spoke German or not. But this shows how important it is to have enough exposure, enough contact with the language during the relevant period, and this is childhood. The lexical domain, of course, is different. Yeah? We learn words our whole life, and here what really matters to have good lexical proficiency is how the amount of contact you have with the language. Okay, I will skip these conclusions and just show you this really last one. This is a recent study I did with 2 colleagues on language dominance. So language dominance is the degree of balance between the 2 languages. So in this case, Portuguese, German. And the question was, how does language dominance change in context of remigration? And which variables affect the balance of the 2 languages? And so we had, in this case, almost 100 participants, but 63 were bilingual speakers of German and Portuguese who grew up again in Germany or in the German part of Switzerland. And of the 63, 42 were returnees. So they lived in Portugal when we tested them. And 21 were normal or typical heritage speakers who were born in Germany and lived in Germany when they were tested. And we used the lexical decision task, the dialogue vocabulary test, but we used it in both languages. So they did it in Portuguese and in German. And then a background questionnaire. And so what we did was to calculate differential values. So they did the task in German, in Portuguese, and then we did a subtractive differential. And this means that if they are balanced, then they have 0 in the score because they have exactly the same proficiency in both languages. That's 0. If they have a positive value, then they are dominant in German. And if they have a negative value, then they are dominant in Portuguese. And what we could see, so we also included late learners of German. So Portuguese speakers who started to learn German as teenagers, but most of them lived in Germany. They were highly proficient in German. Some were German teachers even. What we can see is, even though they lived in Germany, all of them, the late L2 learners, all of them were dominant in Portuguese. This was their L1, of course. If we look at the heritage speakers, so these are the bilingual speakers who still live in Germany, but from Portuguese families, we can see that all of them are dominant in German. And this confirms what we know. If they live in this country, then they are dominant in that language normally. But then the returnees are very interesting because they are balanced. So they are at the 0. What does this mean? This means, of course, that they were all dominant in German, but with the return, the competences, they get balanced because their proficiency in Portuguese increases, the German proficiency decreases somehow a bit, and they become dominant and very balanced in both languages. Of course, we then looked at the effects of different variables, and this is to conclude, again, there was, if we looked at the German proficiency, what explained the lower result was only the age of return. So when did they came back to Portugal? Was the language stabilized or not? The Portuguese proficiency, so how proficient they were in Portuguese, the written speakers, was explained by their length of residence in Portugal. So what does this mean? This means they, of course, they were already proficient in Portuguese, their heritage language when they came to Portugal. But being exposed to Portugal, living in Portugal, had an effect of re-exposure, of reactivating even more the language. And so the competence increased. And here it matters for how long you live back in Portugal. And so this shows that with the return, there are dominance changes in this, and it goes in this direction of getting more balanced. So to conclude, what changes when the language environment changes? Linguistic knowledge needs to stabilize in the speaker's mind and to become invulnerable to erosion. And if it stabilizes, then it's very stable. Grammar is very stable. So if children have enough input and daily input during their whole childhood, then they become very competent bilingual speakers, even if then there is loss of contact with one of the languages. And so this is, we'll skip this. This is the take-home message. They just need sufficient exposure to their native languages during their whole childhood. And bilingual competence is quite stable. So the cases of people who did not speak German for 30 years and had perfect German grammar is an example how stable language is if they have enough time to become fixed in the mind. So sorry for delaying this. These are some of my co-authors, and these are the studies I mentioned. Thank you for being present, and if you have questions, I'm really happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Cristina. Some people had to leave, and they congratulate you on a very, very, very nice and informative talk. And I'm sure there will be some questions to break the ice. Actually, I have one which has been forming in my mind as I was listening to you. And of course, you know, my background as a person dealing with the structure of language makes sense, I think. You mentioned at some point that they use V3 orders, right?
Yes.
Which are more Portuguese. But I guess Portuguese doesn't necessarily have the verb in third position, right? It's a tendency, I assume. So it's not a fixed order in Portuguese, right? Like you don't have to say yesterday Peter bought. You can say Peter bought or bought, right? Yes. So, okay. But my question to do with syntax is, in these cases of V3 orders in German, might it be the case that what they have in the very fronted, in the very first position, is something similar to what we call a hanging topic or something like that? Things like, imagine Cristina, oh, I attended this talk of hers, right? Where Cristina is kind of hanging and therefore doesn't really have, there's the intonational break. It doesn't really have a bearing on the word order. I'm just asking from the viewpoint of somebody doing structure, okay?
Yeah.
So it's a naive question.
Yes, it was not the case. So I excluded these cases of topics and when there was a pause. What I counted as V3 were really the sentences with adverb and subject and verb, or these cases mainly. So no, that's not the case.
Something like yesterday
she came.
Right.
Very frequent, and this is really not possible. So the case is like my mother, or no, the book I saw him or no, these were excluded. They are also
because
not
those look like V3 in German, even
Yes.
though in reality they are V2, but you have this
Yeah.
hanging feature.
And they are instances of V3 in German, we know in colloquial, and there are some cases. So these were not the cases.
Good.
Yeah.
Gracias. Danke. Obrigado. Thank you.
Wow. No attrition.
That's as far as I can do. Good. Any other questions in the chat if you want me to read them aloud? Actually, let me check. Okay, it's all congratulations, congratulatory messages. So hopefully we will have some question from the audience. So anything else? Any more questions? Any naive clarification questions?
It's late.
I know.
Not in the US.
True. And you know, German case makes everybody dizzy, you know, when you think about cases and their gender and this and that, it's like, oh, that's one of the reasons why many people give up studying German, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah. My students agree.
Yeah, I guess certain things, plus certain aspects are so arbitrary, I'm sure, right? That either you know them or you don't. So it's extremely difficult to find generalizations for the learner, right?
Yeah, that's why it's so interesting that it's so stable. Right? If you don't speak this language, it seems to be so complex, right? That you don't speak it for 30 years, but it's still, everything is there. Right? If
I know.
It had time to become stable.
Certainly.
Okay.
I wonder if you've had any cases of trilinguals so far.
Yeah, I excluded them.
Okay.
Yeah, by this time because
I can imagine it's complex enough with
I had actually Portuguese, Spanish heritage speakers living in Germany. Very interesting. But yeah, since it could confound the data, I did not analyze them. Yeah.
Because I wonder if there is an effect of language proximity, you know, typologically different languages. I really don't know. I mean, I know this has been looked at in L2, right? Whether it's easier to learn a language that is typologically similar or not.
Yeah.
And for certain aspects, it may help, like null subjects, for instance. If I study Italian or Portuguese, probably I won't make any mistakes regarding null subjecthood since my native language is Spanish, right? But other aspects may actually behave as false friends, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to analyze writtenese from other countries. Indeed, we proposed a project. It was not funded to look at writtenese from Venezuela because there are many. Was a big Portuguese community in Venezuela, and they all know, of course, all coming back. Many of them. It would be very interesting, yeah, to look at their Spanish because it's close related languages. We could. Yeah, we did not have the funding, but it's
hopefully one day
plan, right? To do it. Yeah, it's very interesting. But it's very difficult to have big groups of writtenese, homogeneous groups, and there are not many people working on writtenese. I see that Eileen is here. She is doing very interesting research on Turkish writtenese. So there's some work on Turkish writtenese and and from Portuguese writtenese and Japanese writtenese, Maki Kubota, but not now. I don't know many people working on this, unfortunately, because it's not easy to get them, of course. They are not students sitting there, 30 students in our classroom. Wow, 24. Good, Eileen. Wonderful.
Yeah, for those watching on YouTube, Eileen Koskun-Kunduz claims that she's already tested 24 returnees.
Wonderful. That's a success. Yeah.
All right. So, well, if there are no more questions, we will adjourn the meeting. And of course, thank Cristina again. It's been a pleasure. I think everybody knows that this will be available on YouTube, okay, later on in the next few weeks. So we'll be able to watch it again for future reference. And well, let me ask for a round of applause for our speaker. Thank you, Cristina. Obrigado.
Thank you, Julio. And thank you to
pleasure.
the Cervantes Manchester, to Pedro, who's no longer here, but okay.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for your support and your continued loyalty. See you after the summer.
Bye.
Ciao.